Obviously, Donald Trump, former president, perhaps future president of the United States, is under an all-out legal assault by the American left, looking to imprison him, in their view, hopefully before the election. But he's not the only one. Any number of American citizens have found themselves on the wrong end of Joe Biden's Department of Justice and all these Democrat prosecutors across the country. And there's a real legal effort afoot to go after the attorneys who represent people who are not on Biden's side of the political equation. In fact, Donald Trump's attorneys, people like who have worked either directly for him or in a government capacity, people like John Eastman or former U.S. Assistant Attorney General Jeffrey Clark, are in the sights of the American left who are looking to destroy them and their legal careers. For more on this topic, I want to bring in Josh Hammer now. He's a senior editor at large of NewsWeek and the syndicated host of The Josh Hammer Show, and he joins us on the phone. Josh, good to have you with us, sir.
Vince, I appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
Tell me, if you will, about the saga of John Eastman and what is happening to him right now, because I feel like a lot of Americans just don't know that these attorneys are under an all-out assault by the left at this moment.
It is an un-American and Stalinist tale. That is where I will begin. So if you go back, Vince, John and I went to the same law school. We went to the University of Chicago Law School. I'm quite a bit younger than him, so we didn't overlap. But he's a pretty big deal in University of Chicago Law School alumni world. He's a pretty big deal in legal conservative world in general. He clerked for Justice Clarence Thomas back in the 90s. He was dean of Chapman University School of Law in Orange County, California for a long time. He published prolifically when it came to legal scholarship. He wrote on the Declaration of Independence, on birthright citizenship and the 14th Amendment, on the marriage question, you name it. I mean, he was a well-known conservative legal scholar, not merely
a real lawyer,
legal scholar.
A real lawyer with real chops.
Yes, with very, very real chops. In a different university, could have easily been a federal judge. And after the 2020 November election, he decided to take on an unpopular client. That client, of course, is Donald J. Trump. And in the course of representing his client and zealously advocating for his client's interests the exact same way that I was taught in law school, the exact same way that any other law student who takes legal ethics in law school is taught, for that crime, for having the chutzpah to zealously represent his unpopular client, the then current president of the United States, he has been put through the ringer, Vince. They made him retire from the law school where he served as dean. They stripped him of his visiting scholarship position from the University of Colorado Boulder. They forced him to resign from various academic boards. People went to his neighborhood where he was living in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and put spikes in his driveway. They graffitied "Go Away, Insurrectionist" on the walls of a bridge in his community. As you mentioned, they're prosecuting him. Fonnie Willis is down in Georgia, along with Jeffrey Clark. And now the latest is that last week they had this judge out in California issue a 128-page ruling arguing that his law license should now be stripped in California. And it's ultimately, Vince, the point that I try to make in my column today on this topic, it's ultimately not really about John Eastman or Jeffrey Clark. It's ultimately about trying to subjugate us and cow into submission the next generation of young right-of-center lawyers, young right-of-center law school students, the very folks that I speak to across the country when I speak on law school campuses as part of the Federal Society. It is trying to intimidate them out of joining the next Republican administration in any capacity, to make them unhireable. And it's disgusting. It is absolutely disgusting. And our side has to understand, Vince, that it's not about John and Jeff. This is so much bigger than them.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things that sticks out to me is the fact that Trump is consulting attorneys during the change of government in 2020, going into early 2021, suggests immediately that it's not an insurrection. He's literally asking people to help him navigate the laws of the United States as he raises these challenges. John Eastman comes along and he's got, okay, well, let's take a look at the vice president's role and the Electoral College and how all of this operates. The left wants to destroy him for giving legal advice. I thought in the United States, even the most detestable person is entitled to a legal counsel.
Well, once upon a time, the American left agreed with that, Vince. I mean, go back to mid-20th century in the Jim Crow Deep South when the NAACP was righteously and correctly defending Black Americans who were subjugated by that horrible Jim Crow regime. Back then, the left understood very well that every American deserves legal representation, no matter how popular you are, no matter how you are viewed by the current government, by prevailing societal elites. In fact, as I noted in the column today, there's actually an even older precedent than that. It was 1770 in Boston, Massachusetts, the time of the Boston Massacre. Right. It was a then 35-year-old young lawyer named John Adams who decided that he was going to represent the Redcoats, the British soldiers who were accused of massacring the colonists there, simply to make the point that everyone deserves legal representation. And later on in his life, when he was nearing his death, John Adams famously remarked that he thought it was one of the greatest acts of public service he ever gave to his young country. So this is as old as, well, it's literally older than America, but the left has forgotten these lessons, tragically.
Of course. We provided attorneys to terrorists held in Guantanamo Bay. So yes. Should they be stripped of their law license for having represented enemies of America? Should we suggest that they are somehow terrorists themselves? This logic is insane, Josh Hammer.
It's patently insane, and it can only be understood as just the purest distillation of friend-enemy politics, which is that if you are a friend of the left, if you are a friend of the current regime that is in now power, if you are a friend of the current ruling class, then you are entitled to free speech, then you are entitled to platform access and social media, you are entitled to legal representation, you are entitled to all the various civil rights and liberties that a previous generation of Americans took for granted. But if you are an enemy, if you are part of what Angelo Codevilla called the country class as opposed to the ruling class, if you are one of what Hillary Clinton called the deplorables, then you will not have free speech, you will not have platform access, you will not have legal representation, and oh, by the way, in this case, if you so much as consider representing a high-profile Republican as his lawyer or going to work in a future Republican Department of Justice, you will have a permanent scarlet letter affixed to your resume that will make you unhireable by a big law firm. Look, Vince, I have to mention I'm a lawyer by training. I chat with my lawyer friends all the time. Many of them want to work in the next Republican administration if Trump wins, but they're genuinely reluctant to do so because they need to make sure that they're hireable after that, and they have families to feed and children to put food on the table for. These are real practical concerns for people.
This is not the first time I've heard this, by the way. And it's not just attorneys. It's anybody who's interested in helping the country out. People who are concerned about, if should Trump return to the presidency, what is the left going to do to my reputation if I try and work in that administration? How should people approach that? What advice would you give them as they think through that decision?
So I don't think that there's such thing as one-size-fits-all advice. Everyone's going to have to assess the variables in their own situation and make their own decisions, and I think that we're going to have to, always respect that kind of decision. But to answer your question a little more substantively, I think the mid to long-term solution, and you're seeing this all throughout society. By the way, one thing that happened to John Easton, and it's related to this point, I didn't even mention, he was also debanked. So within the past month, the Bank of America and the USAA both reached out to him and said you have 30 days to close your account, or else ... And I mentioned that because it's relevant to your question, which is everywhere you look across the country, whether it is debanking, whether it is deplatforming, increasingly, whether it is your doctor, your accountant, anyone, we are siloing ourselves into spheres based on political ideology. And it's not like both sides are doing this. The left is obviously overwhelmingly responsible for this descent into this two-tiered America, into this politically siloed off America. But in order to give our people, our side, broadly speaking, more reassurance, we're just going to have to create many more of our own institutions. We're going to have to create many more of our law firms. So there have been the rise, sticking to the legal setting, there has been the rise over the past 15, 20 years of a number of excellent stalwart conservative boutique law firms. Consovoy McCarthy, based right there in Washington, D.C., would be a great example of that. But we don't currently dominate any of the massive big law firms. And we're going to have to start really constituting and building up some of these alternative law firms, some of these alternative banks, platforms. I mean, that really increasingly has to be the solution. I just don't really know what else the option is.
Yeah. By the way, you said that John Eastman was debanked by Bank of America. Does not surprise me. They've done stuff like this before. But USAA, that's the military bank that I think probably a lot of people within the sound of my voice right now, they might bank with USAA. I didn't realize USAA had done that. Did you break that reporting today in Newsweek?
I did not. So what happened was it was last week there was an op-ed at Blaze Media, written by two of John's children, one of whom, Christina, I've been friends with for a number of years now. And they mentioned that in kind of a throwaway line towards the end of their own op-ed. But I was messaging with Christina, and she gently suggested that I go ahead and highlight that because she agreed, as you're also intimating, that didn't get the play that it deserved, because it is a very big deal.
I'm reading it now. I missed it until you just mentioned it. They talked about all the impacts that John Easton has experienced. His friends strip him of board memberships after decades of service. They suspend his membership in academic conferences, claiming he's a threat. They cancel his university classes and force him to retire. The Bank of America and USAA debank him. I wasn't aware of that until now. That's a black eye for that bank, USAA, and here it is. And it just, that's horrifying. And you know, I want to move before we run out of time here, Josh Hammer. I want to make sure to also get in the story of former U.S. Assistant Attorney Jeffrey Clark. He too is going through the ringer right now. What is that about? What can you tell us about that saga?
So in the aftermath of the 2020 election, unlike John Easton, Jeffrey Clark was not a personal attorney to Donald Trump. He was just a fairly high-ranking DOJ official. So he was involved in the discussions about what to do pertaining to the slates of electors, just a broader conversation about whether we can kick it back to the state legislatures to consider the submission of alternative slates of electors. And he basically drafted a memo. He had a draft email that he had prepared to send to some of his DOJ colleagues. He didn't even send the memo. He literally didn't click the send button, if I understand the facts correctly. But nonetheless, the fact got out there that he had drafted this memo, which obviously the left tarred as an insurrectionist, democracy overthrowing memo. And it is the mere fact that he drafted this memo that is currently being used by the District of Columbia Bar, the D.C. Bar, to try to disbar him right there in Washington, D.C. In fact, the timing is funny. It was literally while I was drafting this column yesterday afternoon that I saw John Solomon at Just the News actually broke the story that the D.C. Bar had gone ahead and disciplined Jeffrey Clark literally yesterday afternoon. So there was a disciplinary panel there in the D.C. Bar that went ahead and found him guilty of an ethical violation, which is the first step towards a possible disbarment. So Jeff Clark and John Easton both might be disbarred as a result of this. I obviously hope that is not the case. It is Stalinist, it's un-American, it's disgusting stuff. But that news broke literally yesterday.
And it's not for violating any laws. It's not for hurting anybody. It's for representing clients or giving legal advice.
That's correct. So the argument that they are making is that the legal advice ceases to be legal advice and becomes something else at some point. And, look, if I'm going to have a modicum of fairness here, that's obviously a truism, right? I mean, you can't issue legal advice to murder your neighbor. I mean, and that's obviously true, but that's a ridiculous hypothetical. It's the exception rather than the rule. Within the confines of anything remotely resembling good faith argumentation, you have an ethical obligation to zealously advocate for your client's interest in a legal proceeding. And going back to Easton for a second, what he was arguing, his specific interpretation of the 12th Amendment and calling for a more active rather than a passive role for the vice president in the counting and substantive consideration of the state's submission of their slates of electors, that was an issue of first impression. The United States Supreme Court has never interpreted that provision before. So he was well within his rights, Vince, is my feeling and has been my feeling all along. He was well within his rights to offer that line of advice to his legal clients obviously being Donald Trump.
Amazing. So the message of all of this, Josh Hammer, what these two guys in particular are experiencing right now, sounds to me is meant to be a warning to others should they ever want to give legal advice to someone who is politically unpopular or at least not a part of the ruling regime in the United States.
I think it is impossible to interpret it in any other way. And I know that personally, the next time that I'm out there on the law school speaking circuit, speaking to Federal Society chapters, Vince, I plan on just having casual conversations with some of the law students. I genuinely want to know on a personal level whether they're paying attention to this stuff, because I think that they are. I mean, based on my conversations with my friends who are not law students but young lawyers, they're absolutely paying attention to this. They're absolutely weighing this into their considerations for their future career plans. That is the clear and unambiguous message, and it is a chilling one. It is an un-American one, and our side has to do, I think, a much better job of telling these stories and sounding the alarm.
Josh Hammer with an important column on this subject today. He's the senior editor at large over at NewsWeek. Sir, thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it. An important topic.